Welcome everyone to the first online Peace Science Colloquium meeting of the 2018-2019 academic year. This is exciting. This is a series in which we bring peace science scholars to come together to talk about new and ongoing research so that people can get great feedback on their work and we can share this great work with the peace science community and conflict scholars anywhere, especially those who aren't able to make it to the annual meeting. So hopefully we will see everybody at the annual meeting in November in Austin. And for everyone else, I'm glad you're watching. So today we're joined by Jeff Carter, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Mississippi. He's going to present a new project to us that is entitled Leaders, Interstate Conflict, and Spatial Interdependence. Also joining us today are a grand set of discussants who will be talking about this project with us. We have Olga Chyzh, who's an assistant professor at Iowa State University of both statistics and political science.
Hello.
There's Olga. We have Alex Braithwaite, who is a full professor of political science at the University of Arizona. Shana Gadarian, who is Shana Gadarian, who is an associate professor at Syracuse University, and Scott Wolford, associate professor of political science at the University of Texas at Austin. So thank you all for joining us, and we're going to turn it over to Jeff, and I'm going to be timing you, so watch out.
All right, let me try to see if I can get the screen to share. Is that working?
Yeah.
All right. So first off, thanks, Emily, for all the work you're doing with this. And thank you for putting together such a great panel of discussants. When I was starting to work on the presentation, it dawned on me that I actually cite each one of the discussants in the paper. And so I didn't have to add, kind of gratuitously add that in the presentation. It's already there. So thanks a lot. This is the basic idea of this project's been kicking around I've been thinking about it for a little over a year, but I've just really started to kind of focus on it. And the way that I think about this is that maybe the kind of biggest innovation in international conflict research over the past 20 or 25 years is this recognition that political leaders are understood to be key to understanding international conflict and foreign policy. The kind of earliest wave of this, right, I think of it as, or I associate with selectorate theory and research that came after that focused on how political institutions shaped the decisions leaders made. And so one of the kind of implicit assumptions of this was that leaders themselves were interchangeable, right? Everyone was motivated by this desire to stay in power, and the institutions influenced the decisions people would make. The kind of second wave of this leader-centric research, though, has really focused on how leaders' personal attributes and background experiences influence conflict processes, whether it's the initiation of international conflicts, the escalation of conflicts, the pursuit of nuclear weapons, the outcome of interstate conflicts. We have increasing evidence that kind of who runs a country matters. At the same time, throughout the discipline, there's this increasing appreciation that space and distance matters, right? In the American politics literature, you see this in the state politics research. In terms of international relations, we have a lot of evidence that civil conflicts cluster and diffuse, and maybe kind of most importantly for my argument, there's evidence that interstate conflicts diffuse and cluster in space. What I hope to convince you of by the end of the presentation, and if you go read the paper, is that hawkish leaders and dovish leaders also diffuse and cluster throughout the international system. To provide some kind of, just kind of cursory evidence of this, what I've got here on this graph is a map of the world in the 1990s and the average kind of leader hawkishness of the leaders around the world during the 1990s. And I'll talk a little bit more about the measure later. But as you darker colors of red represent relatively more hawkish leaders. Right? So the average hawkishness of the leaders in the international system during the 1990s on this measure comes out to negative 0.04, so it's basically 0. But you see some kind of decent variation regionally. In North America and Central America, the average during the 1990s for kind of leader hawkishness is a negative 0.38. At the same time, in Northern Africa, you've got an average of 0.54. So depending on how you want to think about that, that's a non-trivial variation in the kind of clustering of hawkish and dovish leaders around the world. Again, this is just a quick look at the data, but I think it provides a nice kind of, easy look. Hey, maybe there is some clustering of hawks and doves. So what I'm talking to you about today is to try to convince you why hawks and doves might diffuse and cluster around the international system. To start with, I think it's useful to just think about what we know about hawks and doves. There are kind of 4 things that are really important for my argument. The first is this idea that hawks are more willing to use military force than are doves. Scholars think about hawks and doves slightly differently depending on which research tradition they're coming out of. The first kind of most common way to think about hawks and doves is that hawks pay a lower cost for initiating conflict than doves or participating in conflicts than doves. The second, if we think more about some kind of political psychology research in IR, there's the idea that the kind of personality traits, there's variation in personality traits and risk profiles that mean hawks are more willing to initiate conflicts than doves. So the basic idea is hawks are more willing to use military force than are doves. What follows almost directly from that is there's a lot of research that, indeed indicates that hawkish leaders and governments led by hawkish parties are more likely to initiate conflicts than doves, while at the same time, dovish leaders and dovish governments led by dovish parties are more likely to cooperate than hawks. All right. Most of this research focuses on kind of politics and democracies, but not all of it. The third kind of thing to keep in mind, or that's kind of important for my argument, is the idea or the kind of result that hawkish leaders reduce the probability a country will be targeted in an interstate dispute. This idea theoretically kind of comes from you can motivate it either through the bargaining, the work on bargaining and conflict, or kind of classic deterrence theory, right? If we think that hawks have a lower cost of using force, then challengers are going to be less likely to kind of start a conflict with a hawk because a hawk is less likely to back down. At the same time, if you think about bargaining, because hawks are more willing to use military force, they're going to be less likely to make concessions at the bargaining table, and so leaders are going to be less likely to challenge hawks in a dispute. The fourth thing that we kind of know about hawks and doves is that individuals prefer hawkish politicians and policies when they're facing an external threat. Most of this research has been done in American politics and comparative politics. A lot of it focuses or uses lab experiments to get at this, but we do have some observational research that shows that an increased kind of likelihood of kind of suffering rocket attacks or external attacks results in states voting for more hawkish politicians and leaders, or there's just a general correlation between the probability that you're going to be targeted in an interstate dispute and having a hawkish leader. So the 4 things to keep in mind is the kind of the background of my argument is that, 1, we know hawks are more willing to use military force than are doves. The second is that hawks are more likely to start conflicts than doves. The third is hawkish leaders reduce the likelihood of countries targeted in a dispute. And the fourth is that individuals and domestic populations tend to prefer hawkish politicians when they're threatened. So I argue that these kind of things result in hawks and doves flocking separately. Or another way to put this is that hawkish and dovish leaders should diffuse and cluster throughout the international system. There's been this increase, as I said in the beginning, there's this increasing idea or appreciation of kind of diffusion and clustering processes. When we talk about diffusion, there are 2 kind of generic mechanisms that I think should lead to hawkish and dovish leaders diffusing and then clustering. The first is the so-called adaptation or competition mechanism. And in particular, the relative hawkishness of a leader influences the value of bargaining with a leader in an interstate dispute. Because hawks are less willing to kind of put up with strong demands and they're more willing to fight, then the leaders of other countries are more willing to kind of make concessions to hawks, and they're less likely to challenge a hawk. So if you think about it, this from an individual's perspective, his or her country is likely to do better in interstate bargaining with a hawkish leader than a dovish leader in a crisis. The second mechanism is the so-called learning mechanism. A leader's relative hawkishness sends a signal about the environment. In particular, we know that domestic populations tend to want to have hawkish politicians when they're feeling threatening. So if a neighborhood is full of hawks, then we should know that the environment is pretty threatening. And if that's the case, then individuals should want to have a hawkish leader rather than a dovish leader. At the same time, if a neighborhood is filled with doves, then we can think the international kind of security environment is relatively safe. And so there's no reason to kind of promote a hawkish leader because you're not that worried about being involved in interstate crisis. So if we think about these two general diffusion mechanisms, we can further motivate them with two kind of micro foundations. The first, which I think is a reasonable assumption, but there's no real empirical work on this, is the idea that hawks represent a national security threat to nearby states. They should do this because we know hawkish leaders are more likely to initiate conflicts against other countries than are dovish leaders. When you kind of pair that with the observation that neighbors are more likely to fight than non-neighbors, and countries that are close to one another are more likely to fight than distant countries, then having a hawk nearby represents a national security threat to a country that having a dove just doesn't. The second is the observation that individuals prefer hawks given an external threat. And so, again, as I spoke about earlier, there's a lot of research in American and comparative politics that supports this, and this is a long-standing kind of claim in the IR literature. Paul Hughes talks about this, and you can kind of infer this from some of John Vasquez's work, right? So if we think about all four of these things, then I think this implies that the presence of relatively hawkish or dovish leaders should lead to the diffusion of relatively hawkish or dovish leaders. So how do I test this? Well, I test this using the M-star estimator developed by Chyzh et al. This is a multi-parametric spatio-temporal autoregressive model, and I'm always worried I'm going to screw up the name of that. One of the nice things about this is that it allows you to model both kind of spatial and temporal dependence in the dependent variable. So the dependent variable I use is this measure of leaders' latent hawkishness that I've created with a co-author. If you want to talk more about the measure later, like in the Q&A, I'm happy to. But the basic idea is what we did was we used a Bayesian hierarchical kind of IRT model surrounding the lead data set of Horowitz et al. And so the core of the measure is based on leaders' personal traits. We then augment that with data on leaders' kind of political orientations and kind of general orientations towards the use of force using the manifestos data set and the HOG data set, or head of government data set by Linval et al. And then we have some information on leaders' willingness to challenge external constraints based on work by Peg Herman. For the spatial lags, the kind of key spatial lag is the distance between two states. But then in addition to that, there's a variable that identifies whether two states have been in a mid within the last 5 years. The basic argument there is that a domestic population probably cares more about the leader of a state it's recently fought than the leader of a state that it hasn't. For the unit level variables, the model includes a lag dependent variable, so it's leader hawkishness in the previous year. The combination of the spatial lags in the unit and the temporal lag creates a feedback loop in which the hawkishness of any one of the leader in any one state can influence the hawkishness of the leaders in any other states in the international system over time. Further, it also means that domestic factors in any one state can influence the relative hawkishness of the leader of that state and all of the other states in the international system over time.
About 3 minutes, Jeff.
All right, thanks. So what are the key unit level variables? Well, I control for a lot of things that might influence the relative hawkishness of leaders. You know, are you in a rivalry? Are you in a territorial dispute? Are you in a war? Your regime type, and then GDP per capita. I'm also accounting for a time trend and regional and country fixed effects. I want to skip ahead because I don't want to run out of time. For a brief summary of the short-term effects, I find support for the argument. So the effect of leader hawkishness in some state J on the leader hawkishness in some state I is decreasing in the distance between the two states. Further, if we think about the kind of temporal lag, leader hawkishness in year T is increasing in leader hawkishness in the previous year. So what that means is that whenever you see a statistically significant unit level effect in one state on the hawkishness of its leaders, that then kind of reverberates throughout the international system. Two of the important variables, I think, that kind of show up in these unit effects are that states with higher levels of democracy tend to have relatively more dovish leaders, and states with higher levels of economic development have relatively dovish leaders. So what does this mean? Well, one of the things we could do with the IMSTAR model is look and see how a change in one of the unit level variables in one state then affects the relative hawkishness in other leaders throughout the world over time. So what I did was reduce China's GDP per capita by 1 standard deviation. And because of the relationship between GDP per capita and leader hawkishness, this means China should have more hawkish leaders. What this figure shows is the effect of reducing China's GDP per capita on leader hawkishness after 5 years. And so we can see that China gets a substantially more hawkish leader, but so do the other states in that region. Further, we see more of an effect on the United States and Australia than some geographically proximate countries because of the kind of recent mid variable. So this is evidence that leader hawkishness tends to diffuse throughout the system. The second kind of figure for China is just an excuse for me to throw out a Guns N' Roses reference, and that it's the effect of Chinese democracy on leader hawkishness. So what happens if China would become relatively more democratic? Well, in this graph, darker blue represents relatively more dovish leaders. So China gets a more dovish leader, but so do the other countries around it. And it, you know, given what we know about international politics, having relatively more dovish leaders in Asia is probably a good thing. One of the questions I was asked at OPSC is, how do we know that hawks are actually a national security threat? So is the story you're telling actually going on? Well, I don't have the kind of cross-national survey data to test that, but what I did is to see whether or not a state is more likely to be targeted in a mid as a function of its challengers, leader hawkishness, and the distance between the two. And so I estimated a logit model with robust standard errors clustered on the dyad. And what I found is that it is the case that nearby hawkish leaders represent a national security threat in a way that dovish leaders and distant hawks don't. So in panel A here, the dashed red line is the probability of the states targeted as a function of a hawkish leader. The solid blue line is the probability that you're targeted by a dovish challenger. And then on the x-axis is the distance in the logged miles. And so we see that hawks are having a hawkish challenger is always more likely to result in a state being targeted than a dovish challenger. But the difference between the two, as you see in panel B, is decreasing over the distance between two countries. So what does this tell us? Well, the kind of first immediate result, I think, is that hawkish and dovish leaders do appear to diffuse and cluster throughout the international system. The second kind of point is that hawkish leaders represent a greater security threat to nearby states than do dovish leaders or hawks in distant states. This kind of, provides some evidence consistent with one of the micro foundations of my argument. Big picture, I think that these results suggest it's more evidence that domestic and international politics are fundamentally endogenous to one another. So domestic factors in one country can influence the type of leader it gets, and the type of leader it gets then influences the leaders that we observe in other countries. And we know that leaders influence both foreign and domestic politics. So you really need to pay attention to both domestic and international politics simultaneously. Kind of the last two kind of implications, I think, is that the diffusion and clustering of conflicts might be driven by the diffusion and clustering of hawkish and dovish leaders. It's pretty well accepted that we know hawks are more likely to start conflicts than doves, but we know that international conflicts diffuse and cluster, but what my results show is that it could be the case that that diffusion and clustering of conflict is driven by the diffusion and clustering of hawkish and dovish leaders. Finally, one of the results that comes out of my analysis is that democratic countries tend to have more dovish leaders than dictatorships. Research on the influence of political institutions on conflict tends to assume that institutions shape the leader's behavior conditional on them being in office, right? And so Democrats are more constrained than dictatorships. What my results show is that political institutions are shaping who gets into power in the first place. And so it could be that that's where their real influence on conflict processes occur. And with that, thanks. This is definitely a work in progress, so any and all comments are welcome.
All right, thanks, Jeff. And let's open it up to whoever wants to get started. Shana?
Oh, sure.
Sorry, you unmuted first, so I grabbed you.
I guess so. Thanks for having me. And this is a little bit of outside the kind of work that I usually do. So I do work on political psychology and foreign policy attitudes, but I'm not an IR scholar per se.
Okay.
And so, so the question I think is I want to push a little bit more on this question about whether or not domestic audiences really think of neighboring countries as a threat to them. And there's not a ton in the literature on public opinion that would say that the threat perception that you're citing here is really of neighboring countries per se. So most of the literature you're citing here is about international terrorism rather than regional threats. The Gadamansky and Chyzh work here, I think, is the exception because they're talking about rocket attacks from the Palestinian territories to Israel. But I think I'm just wondering a little bit whether or not you need to establish a little bit earlier that most conflicts happen with neighbors. Seems to me like a starting and necessary place to start establishing that domestic audiences really are scared or are concerned about threats from neighbors. And then I think, so I guess I'm not convinced that there's a lot of literature to say that. And so establishing that earlier on in the paper, I think would be helpful. And then the other thing is a question about the way in which you talk about threats is that they are external. But I'm wondering if you have a sense of what kinds of threats you're really talking about here. Is this about terrorism? Again, the literature you're citing is really about terrorism and terrorism threats. But what if we're seeing regional economic threats, or if the threat is more diffuse, like climate change? Is the argument really that threats alone from neighbors are enough for domestic audiences to want hawkish leaders? Or is this really about particular kinds of threats? And what would we expect to see if the threats were different?
Jeff.
Yeah, so thanks for your comments. You're absolutely right that there's not a ton of research on looking at how the kind of international threats would lead to the types of leaders you get outside of terrorist attacks. You're right that the Gadamansky and Chyzh piece kind of is an exception to that. And so there's not a lot of work I can lean on for that. The idea, though, that states are more likely to be attacked by their neighbors or kind of, geographically proximate countries is one of maybe the most robust kind of findings in the international conflict literature. So I don't think it's a stretch at all to say that you're more likely to be threatened by kind of nearby countries than distant countries, but there's not a ton of work that I can directly cite that says it's the leaders in those countries that kind of represent the threat. And there are a couple of reasons for that. And maybe the biggest one is that until a few years ago, there just wasn't there wasn't great data on political leaders, and especially that would allow you to kind of distinguish between relatively threatening leaders and relatively kind of, innocuous leaders. The other point about kind of specific versus general threat, I think that's a really good point. You can point to some research or at least anecdotal evidence that says that when you get an economic downturn, you see a kind of push towards or greater support for nationalistic leaders or populist leaders that often tend to be more aggressive. But I'm unaware of anything that says that just represents great support for my argument out there. I don't think that necessarily means that I'm wrong. It's just that it's not out there. That I don't think people have quite looked at the question like this.
Shana, do you need to follow up?
Oh, I mean, I have a couple of other follow-up questions, right? So, but I want other people to be able to chime in. But I do want to, I want to again try and think through about whether or not hawkish leaders are really just right-wing leaders by other names, right? And so thinking about whether or not, and this is tied to the kinds of threats that, so we know in the political psychology literature that people respond to threats in a kind of specific way. It's not that necessarily that I have terrorism and then I want all right-wing policies, right? It's that I have terrorism and I want leaders who can protect me on issues surrounding counterterrorism, or what elites tell me is about counterterrorism. And so hawkish leaders come with a set of other kinds of policies that tend to be more right-wing. And so I'm wondering if there's a way to see whether or not you're really charting the diffusion or contagion of just right-wing leaders and policies rather than hawkishness per se. And this is tied to, again, like, what is it that you think publics are responding to? What kinds of threats are they responding to and then want in their leaders?
Yeah.
Jeff, quick, and then we'll get Scott.
Yeah, so that's actually something I could get at empirically with these measures. So the measure that I'm using in the paper right now does incorporate the left-right distinction, but I have a version of the measure that doesn't look at that, right? And so maybe it would still be correlated with left-right, but that wouldn't be baked into the measure.
Scott, you're muted.
I am. Okay.
And then Alex.
Of course, I unmute and then I clear my throat, right? Great timing. First, Jeff, I think this is really, it's really interesting, and it spurred a lot of thinking on my part as I read it. And my main comment is mostly theoretical, and I'm going to mention some stuff in the paper more than in the talk, which I hope is okay. But I kept thinking about, like, I think what's important is that you show that these types of leaders cluster. But we always wonder why, right? And I think that one thing you mentioned is that maybe people want a hawk when they're surrounded by doves. I don't think that's inconsistent with the results that you present, right? Like, you kind of mentioned it in the paper as a challenge, but if you look, like, your outcome variable is a measure of hawkishness, right? Like, all it takes is one in a region and it should start to go hawkish, right? So I think this is a little more general in terms of what's possibly causing it. I think it's consistent with more stories than you're almost giving it credit for, right? And I realize I'm saying that multiple paths to explaining it, I'm spinning that as a positive, but I think that's okay right now, right? Like, I don't think that's necessarily a big alternative, but it does make me wonder how countries are actually making this choice to respond, which is kind of similar to Shana's question, right? Like, because I keep thinking about when countries have the opportunity to replace leaders, which is a big part of this, and there's wide variation in that. But again, here's the thing that looks like a bug but might be a feature, I think, is that you've got a few people that really or a few leaders that stay in power for quite some time, and there's going to be more turnover around them. And I wonder if you can use leaders that kind of are fixed in place for a while to kind of look at what's happening in nearby countries to see what that diffusion looks like. So, like, in your first graph, you've got China with a hawkish leader in the 90s, which for the most of the time, I'm assuming, is dung. and and that's probably the revolutionary past thing popping up for him, right?
Right.
But you've got more turnover in the region. So I wonder if kind of like I don't know, I don't want to say a qualitative validation, but like just kind of like drilling down into the data to kind of see, is that what we're actually seeing, right? Dung's in power for a while, he's a hawk. And when there are elections or regularly scheduled party congresses nearby, if those other countries are ticking over, that might be a really cool place to look, to kind of say, yeah, it's another way to rule out the common shock story, right? Because this was a pretty violent region, but if you can still see kind of this response to Dung that's based on when countries have the opportunity to change leaders, you might kind of get closer to picking out what the mechanism is, right? So I guess that's more of a lengthy suggestion than anything else.
I've got 2 fingers from Olga.
Yes. So I wanted to kind of, Scott touched upon a lot of different points, but I wanted to follow up on the theoretical theory development. So I want you to think maybe more carefully, or maybe spend more detail in the paper explaining how do hawks interact with different types of leaders in their neighborhood. So what happens if there's a neighborhood of doves? It seems like, according to your theory, it can be easily invaded by hawks. But what happens if we have a neighborhood of hawks? How does that go back to doves? So if you're going to continue building on the evolutionary game theory, then there's some kind of cost of having a neighborhood that's populated by hawks, because hawks, and here it's important to figure out what hawks do when they're in a neighborhood populated by hawks, right? So do they fight if they really like to fight, or because they don't get targeted, is there just no conflict? So in the evolutionary game theory, there'd be some cost of having a lot of hawks. And so they would kind of exhaust themselves and eventually be replaced by doves. So I want you to think more carefully about all these dynamics. And also I want you to think more carefully. It seems like your theory is really focused on hawks currently, but I think you should also think about doves. And this is the same process that leads to hawk diffusion versus dove diffusion.
Yeah, thanks for both of those sets of comments. Getting to kind of Olga's first point more specifically, this is a comment that I've gotten from other people, and I think that I do need to think more about kind of how do hawks interact with other leaders in the neighborhood, right? And you mentioned kind of evolutionary game theory, and right, Axelrod's a nice place to start with this. And it strikes me as plausible that the optimal response for a domestic population is conditional on, it's not, there could be different distributions that would lead to kind of different expectations as being optimal. And so from a theoretical perspective, I think it's important to think about it. Empirically, I'm not exactly sure how I would start to get at that along with the stuff that's already in the paper within one paper. I just think that it's a lot. But I think you're absolutely right in kind of thinking about the Axelrod-esque dynamics, or the kind of predator versus prey models and things like that's a good place to think about. You're also right that the focus tends to be on hawks rather than doves. And I've got some notes on expanding on doves that just didn't make it into this draft of the paper. And this kind of feeds into something you said also is really consistent with Scott's point about thinking about when you've got the opportunity to replace a leader. I hadn't thought about using the leaders that are in power for a really long time as a way to kind of probe the mechanism. I've been thinking in the other direction. And as you know, I've had RAs collecting data on the losers or the runners up in elections in Latin America and South America, kind of post-World War II, for all their personal characteristics, so I can kind of create analogous measures of hawk-dove for the primary political challengers. And what I've been thinking about is kind of looking to see what the neighborhoods look like, or what the relative kind of hawkishness of the leaders in a neighborhood look like, and how that affects who wins or loses elections, to get at the mechanism a little bit more carefully, to see if they're actually winning or losing elections. And the other thing about that is just from an empirical standpoint of using more like a spatial duration model that, you know, kind of more explicitly looks at turnover versus just kind of the hawkishness of the leaders in the state. But yeah, these are all great questions and points that I need to think more about.
Alex.
Great. So thank you. Good to see you all. Thanks for this, Jeff. It's, I think, a really fascinating paper. I enjoyed the read a great deal. I want to focus in on a couple of things that have been said already, and then offer one newer comment. The thing I want to focus in on that's been said already is Scott's point. And I'm wondering whether you can speak a little bit to this question of whether hawkishness changes only when leaders change, or whether leaders change their level of hawkishness. And I think if you've got both of those sources of variation, it would be really interesting to play with that, to demonstrate why those two processes might be occurring, because I think you need to be able to show that some leaders can change hawkishness in order for your story to work in many of these cases. You've argued that leaders and hawkish leaders diffuse and cluster, and I would encourage you to think about what it is that's diffusing, because we know it's not physically the leaders. So part of this gets back to the original comments about what is the threat here. But I think it would be good to focus a little bit upon whether you think it's threat that's diffusing, or whether you think it is a set of policies, as Shana was pointing out, or whether you think it's some characteristic of leaders that is diffusing, which wraps into the point that I actually wanted to make when I first raised my hand a few minutes ago, which is that you're arguing that leaders cluster as a result of adaptation or competition on the one hand, or learning processes on the other. In the paper, you do a nice job of talking about other mechanisms that might explain diffusion, which includes coercion and emulation. But you don't do much to try and dismiss those as alternative explanations. And I think you ought to spend a bit of time here, because if I think about a coercion-based logic for diffusion, I would think about external imposition of leadership, for instance, right, which is vanishingly rare, but not throughout the time period. So that coercion argument actually makes some sense to me, that we have, during the Cold War at least, leaders being imposed. On the emulation side, I think you've got essentially a learning argument, but the difference between learning and emulation would be the amount of time it takes for diffusion here to occur. So if you look at Kurt Whalen's work, he does a fantastic job of trying to distinguish between learning and emulation. And I worry here that if you've got too short a time lag, you're actually picking up something like emulation. So there isn't a rational learning process. There's a sort of quick response from citizens who demand a change on the basis of something they've observed, but haven't yet learned anything from. So I like that you list these mechanisms for diffusion. I think I'd like a bit more time dwelling on those and delving into them.
Yeah, so kind of starting with your last point, I think you're right. I don't spend much time on talking about the other mechanisms. I've thought a little bit about the coercion mechanism, and I think you're right that you get, especially with the U.S. and to a lesser extent the Soviet Union during the time period, right? Maybe that's not quite true, but you have these kind of external actors kind of imposing or at least strongly influencing the leaders we observe in kind of the countries throughout the world. So I really like that idea. And I hadn't spent much time thinking about emulation versus learning, but it's something I should do. You asked kind of the first question you had about, does hawkishness change within leaders' tenure or just when the leaders change? The answer is both, right? It can change within leaders' tenure as as a result of any number of processes, but especially, 9/11 is a nice example. And Jonathan Renshaw's got a paper in JCR about how that affected George W. Bush's beliefs about the world and subsequent behavior. Or do you get just changes when the leaders change? The measure that I have is just, it doesn't vary within leaders' tenure. And the reason is that we just don't have enough data kind of cross-nationally that's publicly available at this point to incorporate it into the measure. It's something that I've thought about and talked about with kind of my co-author Chuck Smith about doing a follow-up paper on, but the current measure just doesn't do that. And so I think that the way that I think about this is that I'm underselling kind of the variation that's actually there. And so you're right that it's something that I should at least talk about. And then, you're kind of following to Shana's point about what's the threat or what's diffusing. I think that's right. I've thought about it just in terms of leaders and kind of framed it just in terms of leaders. But, a set of policies come along with the leaders that a place elects or selects. And so I need to be kind of more careful in teasing that out of it.
Shana.
To follow up on some of these points and asking about whether it matters if the country is big or small and can protect itself. So, I mean, I was a little bit struck by the map that the effect of China's hawkishness kind of diffuses to Australia and to the US. And so if the US is feeling threatened by terrorism or nuclear policy, a hawkish leader is pretty helpful here because our military is big enough to counter other countries. But if a small country is feeling threatened by a big neighbor, is a rational response to want a leader who wants to fight? Or are there some benefits that small countries get from regional alliances? I didn't hear very much about the role, if any, of regional alliances, security alliances that might matter.
Oh, hang on just a second, Jeff. You're muted.
Is that better?
Yeah, sorry.
All right. So I think you're absolutely right that the effect of the relationships would vary as a function of a number of different kind of factors. You mentioned the size of the countries, or thinking about kind of the military capabilities of both both state I and state J in any pair of countries. So I think that's right. I think you're also right about thinking about alliance patterns and kind of more generally about the security network states find themselves in. And so it's something I want to look into. But one of the things that I've talked to a couple of people about this, is it seems to me that you can think of this, that it matters not only whether or not you're closely integrated with another country or you're like really opposed to someone, and that you could see there are arguments that suggest you should see different patterns of diffusion, or you should see the same thing. So imagine your closest ally adopts a hawkish leader. Well, maybe that means you need a hawkish leader too, because they're getting ready to fight, and so you want to go along with them. At the same time, you could see kind of like a substitute thing where, well, if they've got a really kind of strong hawk, then we don't need one, right? Versus if your kind of worst opponents or big rival, you think they're probably going to move together, where if they get a hawk, then you should respond in kind. But maybe it goes in the opposite directions. I think that I can tell myself stories about all
Sure.
of these, but I think I do need to kind of work on parsing out the way this actually works and how kind of context conditions this generic kind of, average relationship.
Let's see, Scott.
Okay, so I kind of had a thought or a question about one of the last results you mentioned, which is that democracies tend to select relative doves, right? And I wonder how much of this has to do with the period that your data cover, which is 1960 to 99, right? Where, excuse me, like democracy at this point is like this, they're the status quo powers, right? These are countries that don't really want to rock the boat. But you could imagine that in a different era, like before the First World War, the average democracy could have an appetite for destruction that would be quite a bit different than what we see here, right? Like, so I think I would just encourage caution on, right, like interpreting the results for democracy, right? So, like, the implicit story here is that the democratic piece is a function of selecting dovish leaders, but that's not like a normative feature of democracy. That's just the fact that here it would be that in this period, we can't tell if it's that or if democracies just are status quo powers, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, and kind of, the results could definitely be kind of time bound. But you said something that actually makes me think that this could be really consistent with it, right? Because we know that democratic peace results are strongest empirically, right, in that post-World War II period. And so if those results go away during the period that you're describing because democracies are less likely to select those dovish leaders, that's, I have to think about that.
Right. Because then you could imagine there's some different regime type. So if you had a bunch of dissatisfied democracies, they very well might have hawkish leaders. Right?
Yeah.
They would still cluster, though.
That's true. And so, yeah, I hadn't really thought about, I mean, just generically, you're right. This could be a time-bound result. But I hadn't thought about thinking about the satisfaction and kind of dissatisfaction with that. Good idea. Thanks.
Olga.
Yes, so my point is not very related to what we just talked about, but as a methods person and as a spatial modeling person, I thought that I should give you some feedback on that part of the paper as well. So first, I know you have a separate paper with the data, with the leader hawkishness data, but I think you should still spend more time on this paper, in the current paper, giving examples and describing your measure. And maybe show at least, so I want to know the range of the measure, for example. I want to know the factor loadings of different components. You mentioned that this is a static measure, so that I didn't see that in the paper. So I think you should just spend more time describing the measure. You also, I think, should explore the effect of uncertainty, right? So the measure produces the point estimate, but also there's, you can calculate, right? There's variance on that. So I think you should try to also show some results associated with that. And then I also have some points about the spatial model. So I know you model it very closely after Chyzh, and Niemann, but I really strongly encourage you to read my forthcoming paper in political analysis on spatial modeling, in which I actually critique a lot of the use of spatial autoregression. The biggest problem with the use of spatial autoregression is that the instantaneous effects actually are not interpretable. So you can have a positive coefficient on the instantaneous spatial effect, and it does not actually necessarily apply that there is positive dependence in the data. And the same with the negative coefficient, right? So those coefficients are completely meaningless unless you do more with them, like calculate cumulative effects, which you do with your maps, so that's great. Right. But I wanted to really encourage you not to focus on the instantaneous effects at all. And if you wanted to be able to interpret effects, then there's a related model that you can estimate. It's called conditional auto model, and it just makes slightly different assumptions that allow for researchers to directly interpret effects from the table. Yeah, so those are my kind of big points that I really wanted to mention before we end this.
Yeah, thanks for those. I'll definitely take a look at your political analysis paper. Congrats on that. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I tried in the paper not to spend too much time on those the short run effects, just because knowing less about spatial stuff, but more about time series stuff, right? That's always tricky. But yeah, so thanks for that.
Alex.
Great. Yeah, I'd like to stick on the theme of time and space for just a second or two. I know I can never talk for just a second. So on the time,
take all the time and space if you need.
Thank you. On the time side of things, I think it would be nice to talk a little bit about what expectations we might have for how long it takes for this threat to manifest. And your conversation about rivalry made me think about one way in which we might think there are sort of multiple time lags really in operation. I could imagine with a rival state that change in leadership is going to cause a reaction very quickly. Right? You have a great deal of knowledge about that state. You've got good reason to suspect that you understand that a change in hawkishness is meaningful. I would imagine with non-rival states, you're much less likely to trust the new signal that emerges for a variety of reasons. As I'm saying it, I can probably spin the logic in the other direction as well. But I do think at the moment, you've just got one time lag in here where you're assuming that this process is occurring sort of annually, but equally across all of your units. So I think it would be nice to spend a bit of time thinking about what might trigger a quicker reaction or a slower reaction. And that feeds into this question of space, where I know you've spent some time thinking about what's the appropriate reference here. Right? You've got proximity, which I think any spatial model ought to at least speak to proximity initially. You've then talked as well about previous mid-activity, sort of an element of rivalry. But I would encourage you to sort of dig a little bit deeper there. I know you've thought about this because you've talked to me about this via email. But I think of the Beck, Gleditch, and Beardsley paper from more than a decade ago. So I think thinking about social ties, when I look at your maps, what I see are a series of alternative references. So maybe there's something for our favorite old political relevance, the relevance of dyads. Maybe there's something here for a network of trading partners, for instance. So yeah, time and space.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. One of the things that I've been trying to think about, and this gets back to a related point a couple of people have made, is thinking about kind of security networks more broadly. I mean, alliances are kind of the easiest place to go, but that's really a rough proxy. And it's something I think about, but then also trying to balance with how much do I want to try to fit into one paper. But I think you're absolutely right that, in terms of space, there are other things besides distance and mid. Rivalry is kind of an obvious one, but then that also plays into the time, kind of length of time that this process should kind of play out over. So I think you're right.
Anyone else? Scott.
What? Is this a cold call?
No, you're unmuted. Again, I'm taking these as a signal that I shouldn't dig.
Let's see.
We're good. Oh, Alex has one more.
I'm happy to jump back in if that's not impolite. Up front, and a couple of people have mentioned sort of cases, examples. I really was. I mean, I hate this comment, but I really
Everyone makes it anyway.
Was wanting. Yeah, exactly. I'm going to be duplicitous like this, but I really wanted a couple of examples threaded through here. I think it would be really nice to pick on the China case in the way that Scott had mentioned. But I think leading off with that would be really powerful for me. It would be great to talk a little bit about that example, just to highlight a flaw or an issue that exists as well, which is how you're capturing change in hawkishness and being open about that, which I think feeds back into what Olga's talking about, which is just a little bit more information on the measure. So I think having that example dotted throughout would be really useful. And then with your maps, I really like the use of this validation technique, but I was left wondering why you're picking on democracy and GDP and not hawkishness itself. So okay, I understand that this allows you to show the sort of reverberations, but the bit that was missing for me was understanding whether actually the change in hawkishness is happening, because you're building in an assumption there that democracy changes, which leads to hawkishness changes, which leads to hawkishness changes elsewhere.
That's a good point. why did I pick kind of democracy and GDP per capita? I mean, the easy answer is because they were significant, right? And so it's more likely to induce these changes. You know, I like the idea. I've thought of a couple cases to kind of work in. Part of me has thought about thinking about kind of, you know, changes in the leadership in countries in the run up to, say, you know, World War I or World War II, but focusing on Scott's idea about thinking about when you've got a really long serving leader, that it might be nice to have a unified kind of example to kind of draw on for multiple aspects. So I like that suggestion.
Olga.
Yes. So as somebody who has to sell these types of papers a lot, I think the toughest part about it is to pick the example that's convincing to people. So I don't know, I was not a huge fan of the China example. I especially didn't like that you shocked its GDP and decreased it by 1 standard deviation. I did not think that's very realistic given that China continues to grow. So I really encourage you to try to come up with an example that maybe is more convincing, because from as far as I can tell, it can make or break the paper, a paper like this, if you, because people really question, like really really nitpicky with these examples and really want to be convinced by them. So I would really encourage you to think about it.
Yeah, one of the you know, if there would have been infinite time prior to sending this paper out, I had an idea of kind of thinking more about Iran or Iraq, because these are both regimes where they've been involved in conflicts. They're clearly a rivalry dynamic there. And the United States and other countries are interested in what happens in that region. And given kind of how many countries they're located near, you might see kind of more interesting effects. The initial decision to choose China was that, you know, it's a major country, right? And, you know, there's all these discussions about how, you know, what are the implications for a developing China if it continues on the path that it is, and, you know, if we have democratization or backsliding and consolidation of power under Xi, how might that influence things? But I think you're right that kind of some more careful thinking about examples, whether through the maps and kind of quantitatively and or kind of qualitative to kind of flesh out the mechanisms would be useful.
Well, like especially at least explain what. Sorry, I'm interrupting. At least maybe explain like what would it mean for China to drop on its GDP so much? Does it mean that Xi is no longer in power and he's replaced with somebody, or did he just really mismanage something? Like what? Like give more context to your examples, maybe
Okay.
at least.
Thanks.
All right. Any last thoughts from our panel?
I had a 2, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this comes down to kind of thinking about examples and also places to kind of like isolate what the mechanism could be. And I don't know enough about what the data look like, but if you could find a place, like a situation where a hawkish leader comes to power in an otherwise pretty peaceful region, right? And then trace through your data what happens, you've got a pretty clear story there. I think that's kind of like, that's the smoking gun, right? Example. Because it's not like, it's the shock is the hawk, right? It's not some history of conflict. Because, you know, you look at that map in the 90s, and these are a lot of countries with a lot of borders, a lot of recent conflict, right? And again, this may be demanding more of the time period than you have, right? But just that, an example of a hawkish leader coming to power in a peaceful region, as in with not a lot of conflict in it, right? Separating that particular story, that would be so cool. You know, whether you can find that, I'm not sure, because, you know, everything's endogenous to everything else, and the way I think about the world, that might be tough, but it would be
Right.
Especially if you had the data on like these runners up, if you had like an unexpected hawk, right? So this isn't even something people are necessarily preparing for. That would be awesome. Again, I don't know how feasible that is, but while we're just demanding crazy things, right? Sorry, I will demand crazy things, and other people aren't. But
No, I like that idea, especially it's something I'll have to dig into, but especially pairing it with the runners up stuff, that might be really nice. And given that there's clearly, variation in economic performance in South America during this period, and variation in the likelihood of conflict in the region over time,
Right,
that
'cause
could be
there's-
really useful.
Because there's that there's a 95 near war between Ecuador and Peru.
That sounds right.
But there's not a lot of conflict before that, even in this period. So maybe.
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. This was an excellent conversation, and thanks, Jeff, for sharing your work with us. For anyone who's watching, just a reminder that you can find Jeff's paper, the current draft of that paper, on the OPSC website, and I'm sure he would share it with you as it progresses along as well. So just email him and let him know. Thank you to Alex and Olga and Scott and Shana. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, especially with Jeff. And we are back on again in 2 weeks, and we're going to have a really interesting talk. So thanks again, everyone, for watching, and we'll see you next time.